February 1944, near Camp Dix, Illinois. A wooden classroom stands beside the barbed wire perimeter, its paint chipped, windows fogged from a coal stove inside. A young American teacher, Mary Henderson, walks in early with her satchel pressed to her side. She lights the stove, wipes chalk dust from the board, and prints one word in block letters: "Welcome." Outside, the air carries the sound of boots and clipped orders. German prisoners, marched from their compound under watch, shuffle toward the building. They've been cutting timber all morning, their faces wind-burned and wary. When they reach the door, one guard gestures for them to enter. None moves first until Mary steps aside and nods. Her voice is quiet, almost conversational. "Come in, please." The POWs file in, 6 of them, caps in hand. They stand awkwardly by the benches, unsure whether to sit. Mary motions again, and the guards take their places near the door, rifles slung but eyes easy. The stove ticks. Steam lifts from the prisoner's gloves. She starts with the alphabet. Chalk squeaks across the board. A, B, C. Her accent is flat Midwestern, theirs guttural, uncertain. Each time they repeat, the sound softens. She draws simple objects: a cup, a chair, a shoe. One of the men murmurs the German word before catching himself. She smiles and writes both side by side. No correction, no judgment. Just the small act of pairing words that once stood apart. By the end of the first hour, laughter edges in, the nervous kind that releases air long held. A guard shifts, then smiles too. It feels like a place where the war is muffled by routine, by syllables passed carefully from one mouth to another. That afternoon, the camp commandant stops by. He watches from the door, expression neutral. Mary doesn't pause. She keeps teaching. The prisoners don't salute or stiffen. They keep tracing letters in their notebooks made from leftover supply paper. When class ends, one man hesitates before leaving. He points to the word "welcome" and says haltingly, "We thank." That night, back in her small rented room in town, Mary copies her lesson notes into a ledger. She writes about their eyes, how they changed halfway through the hour. She doesn't call it hope. She calls it attention, the kind a student gives when he forgets who is supposed to be the enemy. Days turn to weeks. Each session begins the same: the word of the day, the quiet shuffle of boots, the scrape of chalk. The guards no longer stand as close. Sometimes one leans against the doorway, listening. One morning, after a thaw, Mary arrives to find the classroom swept, ashes cleared from the stove. A folded note rests on her desk. It's written in English, uneven but legible. "We clean for teacher. Thank you for the words. No names, no signatures." She doesn't mention it to the officers. She only adds a new word to the board that day: trust, and waits for them to arrive. Outside, the camp still hums with orders and curfews. Inside, she begins again with a piece of chalk, the sound steady and human, a rhythm that belongs to no army. By late March, the ground around Camp Dix began to soften, the snow thinning to patches of mud. The war still raged across the ocean, but here, the rhythm of the classroom had taken on its own quiet permanence. Every Tuesday and Thursday, at exactly 4 o'clock, 6 men walked from the compound, carrying notebooks made of ration paper, and Mary Henderson waited with the same calm patience. She greeted each one by name, not rank. They were men in their 20s, a few in their 30s, farmers, a baker, a school clerk. Most had little English beyond yes, no, and thank you. But their eagerness was unmistakable. Mary noticed how they began straightening their hair before class, how one smoothed his shirt with the back of his hand as if preparing for something sacred. That week she introduced verbs, to eat, to work, to wait. She demonstrated with gestures, smiling when they understood. The guard at the door sometimes chuckled quietly, and one afternoon he whispered to another, "She's got them saying please better than our recruits." Mary rarely thought of herself as doing anything extraordinary. Her father, a postmaster, had raised her to believe order was built on decency. She simply taught what she knew, how to listen, how to pronounce, how to be patient. But inside the camp, word spread that the lady teacher treated the Germans like students, not captives. The smallness of that difference changed the tone of the place. When the camp's chaplain passed by one evening, he found the men still repeating phrases after class. They stood in pairs, pointing to objects, naming them in English, then in German, laughing softly when they stumbled. He wrote in his report that the atmosphere is calmer than usual. By April, the lessons extended beyond words. Mary brought magazines from town, Life, Saturday Evening Post, anything with photographs. The prisoners pored over them, learning to describe scenes, a family at dinner, a boy with a kite, a soldier coming home, sometimes their sentences caught in their throats. Mary didn't press. She simply let the silence fill the room until someone found another word. One afternoon, rain drummed on the roof, heavy and steady. A new prisoner had joined, a man named Dieter. He sat apart, arms folded, eyes on the floor. When asked to read, he refused. The other men glanced at Mary, unsure. She set the book down and said gently, "We wait." Then she began again with the alphabet, tracing each letter as if it were new. One by one, the others joined, their voices forming a quiet cadence. By the letter M, Dieter looked up. By N, he was speaking. The guard at the door said later he'd never seen such stillness in the camp. That weekend, Mary attended church in town. The pastor mentioned her name in a prayer, calling her service unusual but worthy. Some nodded, others looked puzzled. Afterward, an old woman stopped Mary at the door and asked if she wasn't afraid, teaching those men. Mary thought for a moment and said, "I'd be more afraid if they forgot how to speak." When she returned to the camp that Tuesday, a small surprise waited. The blackboard had been washed so clean it gleamed faintly in the morning light. On it, in careful English, someone had written, "Good morning, Miss Henderson." The handwriting was angular, uneven, but every letter correct. She paused, touched the chalk groove on the board, then underlined the phrase once. The men watched her, unsure whether it was approval. She smiled and said, "Perfect." Outside, the guards were talking about the new assignment schedule. Inside, a sentence hung in the warm air, fragile but whole. By May, command received orders to rotate units. Rumor said some prisoners would be moved south for harvest work. Mary tried not to think about it. She planned one final series of lessons, a review of everything learned, a way to leave something intact when the room emptied. The first week of May arrived with lilacs blooming along the fence near the classroom. Their scent drifted through the open windows, mixing with the smell of chalk and coal dust. The prisoners filed in quietly, their boots leaving muddy prints on the wooden floor. Mary had written a new phrase on the board, "Thank you for the lesson." They read it aloud, first hesitantly, then with rhythm. The words came easier now. One man, Franz, even corrected another's pronunciation, smiling shyly as he did. Mary watched and thought how language had become its own kind of peace treaty here, unwritten, unsigned, but felt in every pause. That afternoon she brought a worn atlas from her father's study. She showed them Illinois on the map, then traced the route to Berlin with her fingertip. The men leaned forward, their faces tense, as if seeing distance for the first time. One asked in halting English, "Your brother in war?" Mary nodded once. She didn't say where. They didn't ask again. The next day she arrived early to find small carvings laid neatly on her desk, tiny figures whittled from scrap wood, a bird, a shoe, a little book. None bore names. The guard said he hadn't seen who left them. She kept them lined up along the window, silent proof that the lessons had left some mark beyond words. When the transfer orders came, the notice was brief. The German detachment would leave for Arkansas within a week. Mary read it twice, feeling the weight of an ending she hadn't prepared for. The next class was subdued. She wrote on the board, "Goodbye is also a word." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one prisoner, older than the rest, said softly, "Goodbye is too short." They spent that session reviewing the simplest things, names of tools, days of the week, the difference between was and were. It felt less like instruction, more like holding time still. The guards didn't rush them. 2 days before departure, a storm swept through the county. Lightning flashed beyond the fields. Wind rattled the shutters. The prisoners waited at the gate for word about class. Mary showed up anyway, her raincoat soaked through. The officer hesitated but finally waved her in. Inside, the room smelled of wet wool and smoke. She started the lesson with weather, rain, wind, thunder. They laughed softly when she mimed the storm. For an hour they forgot the transfer, the war, the miles waiting ahead. When it was over, she stood by the doorway, uncertain how to end. One by one, the men extended their hands. The guard looked uneasy but didn't stop them. Rough palms met hers, each grip brief, wordless. She nodded to each man, repeating the same phrase, "Be well." That evening the camp seemed quieter than usual. The guard said the prisoners had sung after lights out, something low and steady in their language, the kind of song men used to steady themselves before travel. The next morning, Mary returned to the classroom to collect her materials. The stove was cold, the benches empty. On the board someone had written, in uneven script, "We remember words." She stared at it until the letters blurred. Then she picked up the eraser, hesitated, and left the words there. A few weeks later, she received a parcel at her home address. No return name, just a postmark from Arkansas. Inside was a folded paper with 6 signatures and a short message in careful English. "Miss Henderson, we learn still. Thank you for the words and for quiet." She read it twice, folded it back, and placed it inside the ledger where she kept her lesson notes. That summer, she continued teaching at the local school, but she never erased welcome from the top of her classroom board. Each morning before her students arrived, she traced the faded letters with her finger. The war would last another year, but in her small corner of Illinois, its echo had softened, translated, in a way, into something almost gentle. By autumn 1945, the war was ending. Newspapers filled with photographs of surrender, headlines about peace conferences, and the slow return of soldiers from Europe. In towns across Illinois, flags came down, ration lines shortened, and the air changed from tense to uncertain. Mary Henderson still taught in the same small schoolhouse. Yet each time she heard the train whistle on the line south of town, she thought of the men who'd once filed into her classroom by the wire, notebooks clutched like permission slips. The Camp Dix compound was nearly empty now. Most of the German prisoners had been transferred or repatriated. The fence still stood, but weeds had begun to climb it. On quiet afternoons, Mary sometimes walked near the perimeter road, carrying papers for grading. She'd stop at the empty classroom, unlock the door, and sit for a few minutes at her old desk. The carvings still lined the window, the bird, the shoe, the little book. Dust settled around them like memory. That November, a new letter arrived. The envelope bore foreign stamps and the shaky ink of travel. Inside, the handwriting was familiar, careful, deliberate. "Dear Miss Henderson," it began, "we are home again, in Germany. The house is half broken, but we remember your class. We speak English to each other so we don't forget the good sound of it. You taught us more than words." It was signed only Franz. Mary sat at her kitchen table, reading the letter by lamplight. Outside, the first snow of winter was falling, the same hush that had filled the classroom that February morning nearly 2 years before. She folded the paper, slid it into her ledger beside the Arkansas note, and closed the cover softly. The world was changing fast now. Newspapers spoke of rebuilding, of trials, of politics. Mary read them, but the stories felt distant. What stayed near were the faces in that wooden room, the sound of chalk, the shared silence between words. She realized she had never thought of them as the enemy after the first day. They had simply become her students. In early December, she returned to the camp one last time before the government planned to dismantle it. The gates were open, the guard towers empty. She walked to the classroom. The stove had been removed, the blackboard faded to gray, but faint outlines of words still marked its surface, echoes of lessons once traced there: trust, morning, thank you. She sat on the front bench and listened. The wind moved through cracks in the wall, carrying the faint rattle of tin roofing. For a moment she imagined the sound of boots on the path, the murmur of German voices practicing their phrases. She could almost hear her own voice repeating them back, steady and patient. Before leaving, she took one piece of chalk from the tray and wrote on the board, "Good morning." Then she stepped outside, leaving the door slightly ajar. Years later, when the camp was long gone and the field had been plowed for soybeans, locals still mentioned the teacher who had held class for prisoners. Some called it kindness, others called it unnecessary. But those who'd seen it remembered the calm around that room, how the guards leaned easier on their rifles, how the noise from the compound softened on lesson days. Mary never argued her reasons. When asked, she said only, "It seemed the right thing to do." In her later years, she kept the carvings on a shelf above her writing desk. Visitors sometimes asked about them. She'd smile and say, "Just something my students made." If pressed further, she'd add, "They learned English quickly." And that was all. One evening, many years after the war, she found herself walking home under a heavy Midwestern sky, the fields silver with frost. A train passed in the distance, and for an instant she thought she heard voices layered in its rhythm, soft accents repeating familiar words. She looked up, breath clouding, and pictured the classroom door, the chalk line of welcome still faintly visible, waiting for morning light.